Russia sits on more oil than almost any country on Earth. It is one of the top 3 oil producers in the world. And right now, in cities across that same country, drivers are lining up for hours just to fill a tank. Some are fighting at the pumps. Some can't get fuel at all. This is not a sanctions story. This is not a story about tankers stuck at sea. This is a story about small, cheap flying machines built in Ukrainian workshops that have done something no army of the 21st century has managed to do to a major oil power: starve it of its own gasoline from the inside. And for the first time since this war began, the man in the Kremlin has admitted it, out loud, on camera. Let's get into why Russia's fuel crisis is not just an inconvenience. It might be the single biggest crack in Putin's war machine. Why this matters right now. This war is heading into its 5th year. For most of that time, Russia's economy has bent, but never really broken. Sanctions came and went. Oil kept flowing to buyers in India and China. The Kremlin kept paying for missiles, soldiers, and Shahed drones. But an economy running a full-scale war needs one thing more than anything else: fuel. Fuel moves tanks. Fuel moves trucks carrying ammunition to the front. Fuel keeps fighter jets in the air. If a country producing millions of barrels a day cannot get gasoline to its own gas stations, that is not a small problem. That is a warning light on the dashboard of the entire war effort. And this time, the warning light is flashing in plain sight, on ordinary Russian streets, filmed on ordinary Russian phones. The facts, in order. Let's walk through how we got here, because the timeline matters. For months, Ukraine has been quietly widening its target list. Instead of only hitting the front line, Ukrainian long-range drones started reaching deep into Russian territory, going after the fuel industry itself, refineries, storage depots, and export terminals. Site index equals 13-2. An Associated Press count found more than 50 attacks on Russian oil refineries, depots, terminals, and other oil infrastructure inside Russia and occupied Crimea since late March 2026 alone. Some targets were hit again and again. Site index equals 13-2. One refinery in the Black Sea town of Tuapse was struck 4 separate times in just over 2 weeks. 2 strikes stand out because of where they landed. Site index equals 13-3. On June 3rd, a drone attack hit an oil terminal in St. Petersburg, sending a plume of black smoke into the sky, just as Putin was preparing to host his own annual economic forum. The exact event where he tries to convince foreign investors that Russia is stable and open for business. Then, site index equals 13-3. On June 18th, a similar black cloud rose over Moscow itself, after a drone strike on the Moscow oil refinery on the capital's outskirts, with oily droplets reported falling from the sky nearby. By late June, the damage had added up into something impossible to hide. Site index equals 13-3. Some form of gas rationing was reported in more than half of Russia's regions. From stations capping how much fuel a single car could buy, to full-blown shortages in places like occupied Crimea and Siberia. In the Siberian city of Irkutsk, the lines got so long and lasted so many hours that the mayor had to bring in portable toilets for people waiting in their cars. Then came the weekend that made this impossible to spin away. On June 28th, Vladimir Putin sat down with state television and, for the first time in this entire war, said the words out loud: Russia is facing a fuel deficit. He called it temporary, and insisted the damaged facilities were being repaired quickly. He said Russia would start importing more fuel to cover the gap. The very next day, Ukraine answered him with more fire. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukrainian forces had struck 2 more Russian refineries overnight, one in Slavyansk na Kubani, in Russia's Krasnodar region, a facility that processes close to 4 million tons of crude oil every year and feeds fuel exports out through Russia's Black Sea ports, and another in the Yaroslavl region, roughly 700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, close enough to Moscow that local officials had to temporarily shut roads leading into the city. Zelensky called these strikes Ukraine's own version of sanctions, ones that Russia cannot simply legislate around. Numbers only tell part of the story. The human side is what makes this feel real to ordinary Russians. Videos have surfaced online showing drivers screaming at each other over their place in gas station lines. In one, two women get into a shouting match over a spot in the queue. In another, from the town of Serov, a man is filmed punching a woman during an argument that started over fuel. This is not footage of soldiers. This is footage of ordinary civilians, thousands of kilometers from the front line, cracking under a shortage that a Ukrainian drone campaign helped create. This is a two-way exchange, not a one-sided beating. On the same overnight run, when Ukraine hit those refineries, Russia fired back with over 100 long-range strike drones and several missiles at Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine's own air defenses shot down the vast majority of them. Russia's defense ministry claimed its forces intercepted more than 200 Ukrainian drones that same night over Russian territory, occupied Crimea, and the Black and Azov Seas. So this isn't a campaign happening in a vacuum. Every refinery strike is happening while missiles and Shaheds are still falling on Ukrainian cities, and while Ukrainian air defense crews are working around the clock just to keep their own skies survivable. That's part of what makes the fuel campaign so significant. Ukraine is running an offensive deep strike operation and a defensive air war at the same time, with a fraction of Russia's population and industrial base. And it's the offensive side, aimed not at soldiers, but at the fuel tanks behind them, that appears to be landing the hardest psychological blow. But here's the twist. Here's where it gets complicated, though, because Putin didn't just admit the problem. He also tried to shrink it. In that same interview, he claimed Russia's gasoline stockpiles were only about 4% lower than they were last year, and insisted that Ukraine's strikes have, in his words, absolutely no effect on the situation at the front. He framed the entire drone campaign as a psychological attempt to split Russian society and force him into a bad peace deal, and said he would not give Ukraine that satisfaction. So which version is true? A country quietly managing a minor supply hiccup, or a country facing a genuine crack in its war economy? The honest answer sits somewhere in between, and that's actually the more interesting story. Energy analysts say Russia probably does have enough fuel in the country overall. The real problem is that it's stuck in the wrong places. Moving gasoline across a country as vast as Russia, from where it's stored to where it's needed, is a massive logistics operation that takes weeks, not days. On top of that, the equipment needed to repair a modern refinery is often specialized and sourced from abroad. Exactly the kind of machinery that Western sanctions have made harder to import. So even when Russia says a refinery is back online, it's frequently running at a fraction of its normal capacity, patched together with workarounds instead of proper parts. That's the twist. This isn't a single knockout blow. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and every cut takes longer to heal than the last one. What this actually means: zoom out, and the consequences stack up in 3 directions. First, the economy. Russia's own central bank has started admitting the damage. A deputy governor told reporters that months of a fuel sector running below full capacity will likely cut into this year's GDP numbers, with the bank now forecasting growth of just 0.5% to 1.5% for all of 2026, a sluggish number for a country funding a full-scale war. Second, the military. Fuel isn't just for civilian cars. It's the same supply chain that moves diesel to tanks and jet fuel to the aircraft flying missions over Ukraine. Even a partial, regional squeeze on refined fuel adds friction to a war machine that depends on moving heavy equipment across enormous distances every single day. Third, and this might be the most important one, public trust. Russia's government has spent 4 years insisting the war costs ordinary Russians almost nothing, that life goes on, that the economy holds, that this is a war fought far away and paid for by someone else. A gas station line does not care about state television. It's a queue you stand in with your own eyes open, watching your neighbors get angry, watching the pump run dry in front of you. That is a much harder story for the Kremlin to control than a headline about a distant battlefield, which is exactly why Ukraine keeps aiming here. This is part of what Kyiv has openly called a 40-day campaign of pressure on Russia, explicitly designed to raise the cost of the war for the people paying for it, not just the soldiers fighting it, but the population funding it every time they pay taxes, buy gasoline, or watch state TV. There's also a fourth angle worth mentioning. Sanctions never really went away, they just changed shape. Years of Western export bans on advanced refining equipment mean that when a drone knocks out a specific piece of machinery inside a Russian refinery, the replacement part often has to be smuggled in through third countries, reverse-engineered locally, or improvised entirely. That turns what should be a routine repair job into a months-long scramble. In effect, every successful drone strike reopens an old sanctions wound that Russia thought it had already worked around. And this pressure campaign isn't happening for free, or without outside help. Ukraine's ability to keep building and launching long-range drones at this pace depends heavily on money and technology from its allies. The European Union alone has been funneling billions of dollars specifically earmarked for advanced drone production into Ukraine's war effort this year, on top of the tens of billions in prior aid from Washington and Brussels combined. Every refinery that goes up in flames on Russian soil is, in a very direct sense, the return on that investment. The bigger picture. Step back, and you can see the shape of a new kind of pressure campaign. For most of modern history, wars were decided by which army could outproduce the other, in tanks, shells, and soldiers. Ukraine, a country that started this war outgunned and outnumbered, has found a cheaper lever, hit the fuel that keeps the entire machine running, and let the shortage do the rest of the work on its own, spreading from refineries to gas pumps to kitchen table arguments about money. Putin's own words are the proof that it's working, at least a little. A leader who spent years insisting this war changes nothing for ordinary Russians just went on television and admitted that it does. He can call it temporary. He can call it manageable. But the queues outside gas stations don't need a translation, and neither does a man in Serov throwing a punch over his place in line. Whether this pressure is enough to push Russia toward real negotiations, or just enough to make its citizens angrier without changing the Kremlin's calculations, is still an open question. History gives reasons for both answers. Sanctions alone never forced Moscow to the table in 4 years of war. Battlefield losses alone haven't done it either. But a fuel line is different from a sanctions headline or a map of the front. It's a problem a person feels standing in their own car, on their own street, on an ordinary Tuesday. That kind of pressure doesn't need a translator, and it doesn't stay contained to the news cycle. It spreads through word of mouth, through arguments at the pump, through a mayor quietly ordering portable toilets because the wait has gotten that long. One thing is already certain. For the first time since February 2022, the war has reached the fuel tank of the average Russian driver. And that is a front line Putin cannot defend with tanks, air defense systems, or a calm interview on state television. It's a front line made of pipelines, storage tanks, and imported spare parts. And right now, Ukraine is the one deciding where it gets tested next. If you want to see the other side of this pressure campaign, how Ukraine's homemade drone boats sank Russian warships in the Black Sea and are now being copied by the US military for a possible war with China, check out our video on the Magura and Sea Baby drones. And if you want more breakdowns of how this war is actually being fought and won behind the headlines, subscribe to Code Story.